On the 10th of August, 1710, the Allied army, under Field Marshal Guido von Starhermberg and the Archduke Charles, defeated the Bourbon army of Philip V in the dramatic Battle of Saragossa. For the young Philip, the battle was a severe setback that allowed the Allies to hold his capital for months. But when the Habsburg claimant, Charles VI, entered Madrid, he would realize they would need to do more than hold it to make himself master of the kingdom. To make things worse, coordinated raids from Spanish guerrillas cut communications all the way back to Aragon and Catalonia. Adding on to this already titanic loss of fortune, Louis XIV sent the Duke of Vendome with additional French troops. He would take command of the Bourbon army in September and got to work. Vendome worked hard to discourage the Portuguese field army under Count Villaverde to provide relief to Starhermberg's army. Vendome then positioned himself between the Allied army divided by Madrid, Toledo, and Portugal. Charles knew it was only a matter of time before he was surrounded by the Bourbon army and more guerrillas. Starhermberg accepted that his previous two victories were in vain, and, reluctantly, he ordered a retreat from Toledo all the way back to Barcelona. Vendome was no Villadarius or Debai. He is considered one of the Sun King's most veteran generals. He successfully conquered Barcelona in 1697, held his own against Prince Eugen in Italy, and personally fought in the melee in the Battle of Oudenarde. The latter would have been a victory if his associate committed an attack. He was an aging man, but led with more energy than many of his contemporaries. The Allies agreed to divide their forces into 4 columns, 1 British, 1 Austrian, 1 Dutch, and 1 made of Portuguese and Catalan troops. As Starhermberg's army marched off, the British, with 4,800 men under General James Stanhope, became separated from the main columns. Reason being was the lack of food to be foraged on their part of the march. Before leaving, Lord Stanhope told Starhermberg to rendezvous with his contingent at Cifuentes. Starhermberg agreed. It would be the last time the men would see each other for years to come. On the 6th of December, Stanhope's column paused at the town of Brihuega, most likely to rest and resupply. Believing the enemy to be 200 miles away, and thinking that the Spanish would not march fast enough to catch him off guard. He chose not to fortify the town, nor did he establish any pickets or patrols. Unknown to him, the guerrillas were coordinating with Vendome's army, and they were not far behind. While Stanhope and Starhermberg retreated, Vendome pursued at a speed never seen in such a season or such a country. Seeing that the British had isolated themselves, he divided his army into 2 wings. He would lead 10,000 men of his army of 21,000 personally to Brihuega. He marched with them day and night, closing in on Madrid. When crossing the Henares River, he inspired his men by swimming at the head of his leading cavalry. And in just a few days, his army marched a staggering 170 miles. Nobody with me imagined that they had any foot within some days' march of us, and our misfortune is owing to the incredible diligence which their army made. The next day, on the 7th, Stanhope finally recognized the massive mistake and miscalculation he had made. He awoke to see Bourbon troops surrounding Brihuega, troops he thought to be weeks away. Starhermberg's remaining contingents were still several miles away at Cifuentes. It was doubtful any message would reach him and Charles in time. Next morning on the 8th of December, every side of the town had been invested by Franco-Spanish troops. Philip V also arrived that morning. He accompanied the Bourbon artillery train under General Valdecañas as it deployed into 3 batteries that enveloped the town. At 3 p.m., General Valdecañas ordered a general bombardment on the town's openings. One of his batteries blew down the front gate, as well as a house full of defenders next to it. Brihuega was surrounded by hills, and its Moorish walls were worn down. These made the town an unfavorable defensive position. Minutes later, the defenders firing from the towers of San Felipe were also silenced by the same artillery. Stanhope could answer with nothing of his own. Meanwhile, outside of Brihuega's walls, Vendome gathered a staggering 32 grenadier companies, converged from the other regiments. Many of them burning with the desire to avenge the defeats of Almenar and Saragossa. The attack immediately fell upon the Cosagon at the south end of the town, and the Puerta de la Cadena at the north end. Another few companies joined in at the gate of San Felipe. Most of the British forces were concentrated at the Cadena and San Felipe gates under General Carpenter, and thus gave the heaviest resistance. Despite the terrible rain of disciplined fire brought upon by the British, they continued the assault and reached the walls. The Spaniards climbed the rubble left behind by the forward battery and engaged in savage melee combat. Carpenter's men at first repulsed some attacks, but once his men sallied out, Valdecañas' artillery annihilated them. Cannonballs tore massive holes into the British ranks and soldiers themselves. The graphic carnage discouraged any further attempts at a counterattack. Vendome, in his usual style, personally put himself at the head of his grenadiers to lead the next assault, much like how he had done at Oudenarde 2 years earlier. His grenadiers this time pushed the British infantry further into the town, off of their initial positions. As Vendome's men poured into the gap, the regular townspeople joined in the fighting. They took arms with whatever they had and surrounded some of the British. Some who had no weapons threw rocks from the rooftops. Carefully aimed artillery shots bombarded the British as they were pushed into the streets. The Spaniards had pushed them out at bayonet point. Stanhope desperately gathered his remaining troops and placed them in the castle yard as their last line of defense. His men attempted to set fire to the town, but all efforts were in vain. The grenadiers from the Cosagon finally broke through and joined with Vendome's grenadiers. The fresh regiments of Manois and Ferrat dragoons had dismounted earlier and rushed through a new breach, also joining Vendome. Despite knowing that he had no chance of relief, Stanhope's remaining men kept up a terrible fire into the evening. Around 6:30 p.m., Stanhope attempted to bring armistice to the battle to stall for time, but Vendome refused. Vendome then stated that if Stanhope did not surrender his men within the hour, no quarter would be given. Stanhope's men still narrowly resisted for a little while. It was only when they had spent all their gunpowder that Stanhope finally gave in and capitulated. Stanhope had lost 600 men killed and 3,800 wounded, including all of Stanhope's generals. All 4,800 remaining surrendered to the Spanish. Vendome's losses were much lighter at 1,200 killed or wounded. In just one swift move, Vendome had virtually destroyed the entire British contingent, and essentially the majority of the Allied left wing. All of the remaining British would be sent to prison camps in Valladolid for the next 2 years. Only 2 British battalions and 1 squadron of cavalry stationed outside of Brihuega avoided destruction. As the night remained young, Vendome urgently signed the capitulation, as he had received reports of Starhermberg's 14,000 remaining men marching to the relief of Stanhope. Starhermberg and Charles did receive the urgent messages to march to Brihuega, but by the time their men had set off, the British contingent had been annihilated. The Allied army lost the majority of its left wing and would need to be hastily reorganized. Starhermberg now just had 14,000 men to Vendome's 20,000. Not an unwinnable margin, but he no longer had some of the best troops of his army. Having lost some of his generals, he replaced Stanhope with General Balcasel. His center infantry would be led by Baron von Wetzel and Antony de Villarroel. Villarroel was a former lieutenant general of King Philip V from 1705 to 09. He was a brave soldier and aided in the capture of Tortosa in 1708. While the war was going so poorly that Louis XIV entered peace talks with the Allies, a conspiracy began that involved Villarroel supporting the Duke of Orleans as the new monarch of Spain. He was banished after Madrid agents detected his involvement. He never saw command in the Bourbon army again. In 1710, he joined with the allies of Archduke Charles after the defeats Philip V had suffered. He would distinguish himself here the most. Vendome was hell-bent on seeking out Starhermberg's army and defeating it. He deployed the main body of his army, about 18,800 men and 22 guns, and marched to meet Starhermberg's 14,000 men and 23 guns. 1,200 cavalrymen and one last cannon were en route. Both armies would decide the fate of Spain once and for all, on a small plain near the village of Villaviciosa de Tajuña. Vendome and Starhermberg encountered each other on the afternoon of the 12th of December, 1710, forming their armies into the conventional style. Vendome's army was incomplete as he waited on the rest of his 1,200 cavalrymen, whose actions would later prove decisive. His last cannon, however, arrived early. The rest of the army couldn't be far behind. The Marquis of Valdecañas now led the right-wing Spanish cavalry, and the Count of Aguilar the left-wing cavalry. Count de las Torres was appointed to lead the infantry in the center. Despite the momentary lack of his full cavalry body, Vendome decided to order an early attack. The artillery commenced firing earlier than that of the Allies, and inflicted heavy losses on the Allied cavalry. The Allies reacted with a fire of their own, but could not keep up with the Spanish gun crews. On the Bourbon right, Valdecañas received orders to swiftly attack the cavalry under Belcastel and rout them off the field. Valdecañas fielded more troopers, and this time they proved themselves more than equals. The British cavalry did not even put up a fight before fleeing. The charging Spaniards then mauled Belcastel's troopers. The fleeing British discouraged the rest of Belcastel's brigades from resisting, and they too were put to flight. Valdecañas' troopers, in the heat of the moment, then crashed into the exposed left flank of the Allied infantry. Here, 7 battalions, not expecting to have their cavalry be beaten so easily, fled with Belcastel's men. All the guns on this flank fell into Spanish hands. This is not to say all the Allied battalions were cowards. The battalions of the regiments Buell, Osnabrück, Verpoorten, and Bouillon managed to hold their ground. Some Portuguese cavalry, diverted from the Allied right flank, intervened just in time to save the Allied right. The remaining infantry battalions converged together to form a large square to fend off the Spaniards. After several attempts to break it, the Bourbons turned to chase already fleeing targets and the baggage train, leaving the battlefield and unknowingly isolating themselves. Worrying that lack of support from the left wing would leave the right to be destroyed and isolated, Vendome gave orders to General Aguilar to charge Atalaya's cavalry. Both Philip and Vendome would accompany him. Aguilar moved and avoided the terrible terrain that once lay in front of them, and charged the exposed flank of Atalaya's cavalry. However, they ran straight into the flank guard made up of Catalonian and German infantry. With perfect timing, Starhermberg personally launched a countercharge and drove the Spaniards in confusion, including Vendome and King Philip. Seemingly to Starhermberg, the battle might be turning in his favor. Using the tactic that worked so well at Saragossa, he hurled forward his center infantry lines against the Bourbon center. The Bourbon infantry were exhausted, and after many rapid marches, that made them a tempting target. Torres's infantry also advanced to meet the infantry of Starhermberg, but he had purposefully placed his own infantry in front of rough terrain to slow down the Spanish and break up their formations. As the Spanish marched into view, Allied fire commenced along the whole first line. It caused further disorder, but did not stop the Spanish advance. They kept up their advance until reaching the first Allied line of fire, and responded with a punishing volley of their own. The first lines of both armies came so close that some battalions fired at each other from as far as 20 to 30 paces away. Spanish regiments that survived Saragossa showed their newfound tenacity. However, officers commanding the brigades of the Bourbon center noticed their sudden lack of cavalry on both flanks, and that the 4 battalions that earlier formed square reformed into line of battle to join their comrades in the attack. Seizing the opportunity, Atalaya and Starhermberg attacked the now exposed left flank of the Bourbon infantry in coordinated fashion. The Allied infantry fixed bayonets and advanced with them pointed at the Bourbon center. Confused and under immense pressure, the Bourbon line fell back in disorder back to their gun line. As they brought the Allied infantry within range, though, the Spanish gun crews fired a terrible hail of grape shot into Wetzel's infantry. The Spanish gunner, Rafael de Silby, described it as follows. After 4 hours of gunfire, while the infantry was falling back, charged by the enemies, we waited for them, and at close range gave against their battalions a barrage of grape shots so apt that, horrified with the ravage, they desperately threw themselves back on their second line, and Vendome's troops were able to reform. Rafael de Silby later turned down an offer as Commissioner General of the Spanish artillery for this crucial action. Seeing their men beginning to break after taking such heavy losses, Villarroel distinguished himself by rallying the breaking first line and throwing forward a second line in support. His actions possibly kept the Allied infantry from fleeing. Few other men would have done the same. It was again the turn of the Spanish infantry to take heavy losses. The Walloon Guards and Savoia Regiment took especially harsh punishment, losing several officers and many men. Both sides made small successes against each other, but the battle devolved into a confused, swirling gunfire and melee. The Spanish had lost many high-ranking officers, and no senior command was present or able to lead on the field. Many parts of the line broke into bayonet fighting. Soldiers slashed, thrusted their bayonets, and used the butt of their muskets as clubs. This period style of warfare was not at all as gentlemanly or slow as myth tells. Starhermberg once again threw himself into combat. He helped Villarroel urge his men on, and the first line managed to capture the Spanish gun line. The Allied infantry took them and turned them on the Spanish, unleashing their own wall of grape shot into the shaken Bourbon ranks. Defeat seemed almost inevitable, but just as it seemed like the Spanish would be broken, Valdecañas reappeared on the field, as did Philip V and Vendome. Their final frontal charges dealt the final blow to the engaged allies, which put up a stubborn, yet fleeting resistance. The Spanish retook their guns, and Starhermberg recognized the disaster that could lay before him, and retreated into the darkness with his remaining forces. The Spanish, exhausted by the rapid marches and intense fighting, did not pursue, but unlike Starhermberg, did not yield the battlefield. The remainder of the pro-Habsburg army was only saved by the darkness of night. The ending of the Battle of Villaviciosa is a confused one. Both sides had done well, and many generals distinguished themselves on the field. However, the results will be fully realized the next day. Starhermberg had lost 5,000 men in combat, and another 3,000 men were captured out of 14,000. A multitude of enemy standards and cannon fell into Philip V's hands. The Spanish lost around 2,000 to 3,000 men, but the losses could be slightly higher or lower. Although the Spanish infantry had been pushed to their gun line, the Spanish cavalry once again won the day. Vendome remained not only master of the field, but also master of Spain. That night, Vendome and Philip rode up to each other and congratulated one another on the victory they had won. In just a couple of days, the army that ravaged Spain had now been clearly defeated once and for all. That same night, Philip V slept on a bed of captured standards presented to him by Vendome's men, and the survivors achieved some much-needed rest. Starhermberg had no choice but to take his remaining survivors back to Barcelona. Toledo, Madrid, Guadalajara, and Cifuentes were the first to be lost to Vendome's offensive. His army was still too exhausted, though, to effectively pursue the beaten allies, This had to continue into early January of 1711, where by the 6th of the same month, Vendome entered Zaragoza. That same time, Starhermberg, now with only 6,000 men due to constant raids by guerrillas and pursuing Spanish cavalry, entered Barcelona limping. Barcelona is now the only significant remaining enclave of support for Charles VI. Everything that had been achieved in the brilliant opening of 1710 had been lost. Never again would the Allies conduct such an offensive in Iberia. The campaigning in Spain for the rest of 1711 and 1712 remained a deadlock as the Bourbons slowly crept up to Barcelona's walls. By 1713, only the Catalans would be left to oppose Philip V and the Sun King's armies. Vendome's victories at Brihuega and Villaviciosa, although forgotten among battles like Blenheim and Malplaquet, were among the most decisive. The huge losses suffered at Brihuega would be the final nail in the coffin for Britain's exit of the war. In 1712, they would begin pulling troops from all fronts in Europe, including the great Duke of Marlborough. The rest of the Allies followed suit by 1713. Archduke Charles gave up on becoming King of Spain, and took the throne of Holy Roman Emperor after the early death of Joseph I. As for Vendome, he would die of syphilis in Vinaros, Spain, on the 11th of June, 1712, having achieved his last two great victories. All sides of the war are now exhausted. All fronts of the war are deadlocked. However, the Flanders campaign has yet to see its last great battle. The war in Spain is essentially won, but the Catalans will declare a at-all-cost war for their independence. The eventful campaign of 1710 saw the beginning of the end of the War of the Spanish Succession.